welcome to Game Master Soapbox. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and tonight we are going to be taking on a rather dire subject. Now, I do have a silver lining, if you will, in this very dark cloud, but I want to talk about the cloud first. So let's get right into it, and we'll discuss the issue that role-playing is a dying art.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so as the title suggests, I'm going to be discussing the death of role-playing, and I'm not meaning to sound really particularly negative about it, because the reality is that it's been dying for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, some would argue it's been dying since before it was created, just numerically. Yes, there's been an influx of interest in the role-playing environment. There has been an expansion of the awareness since the development of shows like Critical Role and Adventure Time and these kind of things. And while we are seeing an increase in number of products being available in the marketplace, I really feel that the element of advancement is really behind the curve, so to speak. And to this point, let me explain why I say that RPGs are dying. The concept of a classic role-play scenario wherein a game master sits at the front of the table and pontificates, if you will, about the story, the players then putting in their input and their interactions with it, and then resolving forward within the story. That mechanism is in many ways, for all intents and purposes, already a dead element. And what I mean by that is the concept of role-playing has died a long time ago. The idea that the player is playing a role in a story and advancing the story as portrayed by the game master simply has ceased to exist. Let me give more details. So when we talk about the concept of choosing a battleground for the play environment, we have to set the stage. We are actually discussing the establishment of role-playing as a mechanism for storytelling, and it has in many ways already left the barn, so to speak, on that topic. I have several fans who have made clear to me that their way of play that they prefer is without a game master, without any individual storyteller driving the story, and certainly without any of the guidance that a director or a storyteller or game master would bring to it. So I'm choosing the battleground very clearly here. I am not specifying that role play as a meta process is dying. As a matter of fact, I would say there are probably more people involved in role play today than possibly at any time before, with the much more narrow definition of adjudicator of events within a storyline. But we'll get more into that on a later point. Now, this is one of the primary reasons why game mastery has become under assault, so to speak, is that the concept is that the game masters are the ones who are arguably the bullies in the scene. They are the ones who are driving it. They are the ones who are giving direction to it, and are the ones who make judgments on other players. And that, it seems, has become problematic in the role-play environment. And so the idea that a game master is somebody who is useful to the story has become somewhat of a threat. And by and large, game masters have either shied away from doing their jobs, so to speak, and not been as judgmental or as guiding as they might have been otherwise, or conversely, they've dropped their defenses and become basically footstools and bumper pads, so to speak, for the players to do whatever they want to. And whether the argument is being made for right or wrong, the game masters have opinions and game masters have input into the game, has become really problematic. Now, of course, people coming to the roleplay games today are coming in with a considerable number of unreasonable expectations. They have had the experience of watching 1 or 2 or 10 episodes of a series like Critical Role, wherein they see a very open, interactive environment, a very forgiving one, and of course, with the problems of guidance ignored, they are getting to develop these unreal expectations of the way game sessions should go. The idea that a player can pontificate ad nauseum about a particular point in the story because it's fun to listen to doesn't necessarily work well with the classical environment, and therefore players have become somewhat tyrannical in their processes as well, which has caused there to be a disconnect and a distrust, if you will, from the standpoint of game masters picking up new groups and expanding into new environments because they are simply coming in with these unreal expectations that they have to try to somehow fulfill. Now, of course, the elephant in the room is, of course, episodes like the Critical Role, and I'm not being disparaging of their mechanism. As a matter of fact, in many ways, they've been really helpful to the roleplay environment to give us a wider understanding of what it is that players are to do. One of the challenges that had existed prior to the advancement of the viewing environment was that the players would sit and wait for the game masters to do the majority of the work of storytelling, of embellishing and advancing the plot. And the video version of Critical Role has been really helpful for that. But of course, the concept of the critical role of a game master has pretty much been shut down, has pretty much been cut off, because the game master, of course, is expected to not only be respondent to the way his players feel and what their players want to do, but also to the concepts of what reality is for them, and therefore to adjust his play style to match what the players are, instead of the players stepping to the plate and becoming more than they were before. Of course, game masters and players alike will say, what happens to agency when you have a role-playing environment that has a theatrical feel to it? There is somewhat of a agreement that has to be made between the players and the game master to develop the concept of player agency within the story. And when you are looking at the narrative style that has come up through Critical Role and other video versions, is that you end up with the concept of agency of the players being sacrificed in many ways, because they have to fit into the story as the game master has developed. This, of course, leads to problems, and therefore a pushback from the players saying that the game master needs to release additional agency, which leads to the issues we've been talking about. Of course, there's a bigger challenge, and that is when we run role-playing games, the concept of the never-ending story inevitably ends. I've been GMing for 50 years, and there have been as many games that have started and stopped as there are days of the month. You know, there's always the possibility that your session won't last, either because players move on with their careers or they've had to move. I was in the military, and you know how much change occurs in a military person's life. So the idea that the concept of an ongoing story becomes more and more difficult. I have been made aware of a group back east that claims to have run nonstop for all of the last 50 years, and I call shenanigans on that story only because with the amount of years that I've GM'd and a nearly continuous story arc, it's not that way. There are other things that come up, and if another game master has been able to run for that entire time and has the same players and doing the same campaign, God bless them, but I wonder what that means when they say they never, that their story has been unending. The character life is a partial rather than a one-to-one scale model of what is going on in the characters' lives. So is he referring to legacy? Is he referring to characters that are the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of characters, in which case it becomes a long, drawn-out version of a soap opera? But the reality is that games will come to an end, and perhaps for role-playing, at least for the period of time that we're in right now, maybe it is the time of ending. That is one of the arguments that I've heard, is that we just have been playing for so long that we have lost the ball, so to speak, on what is enjoyable and what is fun, and so therefore we might just need to stop for a while. Of course, the ultimate argument for this is that we have to grow up. I've had countless conversations with countless individuals, both as players and as former players, who simply felt that the story progression was too sophisticated for them as players, and therefore I had over sophisticated the game for youngsters, and they felt therefore that the game needed to change and adapt and become something other than a fantasy roleplay game if we wanted to continue. And again, this to me, it feels like a false concept, because the idea of needing to grow up would refer to the concept that the game is somehow childish instead of childlike, and I would challenge that. Certainly there's always the possibility that what we need to do is change our perspective, and I totally honor that. We'll get more into that in a later episode when we talk about my iterations, but just realize that when we say we need to grow up, maybe we need to close the door and stop roleplay. After all, these individuals who are calling for the end of roleplay, or saying that we need to maybe change the format, maybe disconnect from the long-term form, go to the more individualized, because after all, it's merely make-believe. It's all in the minds of the players anyway, so perhaps if we just realize that it's a fantasy, then we can treat it appropriately. But here's the trick. It really isn't. The idea that role-playing is a make-believe environment is certainly an aspect of role-playing, but the prospect of a role-playing game is that we can perceive of the changes that are going to happen over time in a much shorter period, so that we can look at the analog outcomes and therefore react to them in a more mature way. So the idea that we are supposed to somehow quit fantasy in order to grow up or become more than we're supposed to really is the fallacy. The reality is that we are endeavoring to and be involved in a practice of thinking beyond the sphere, or outside the box, as the saying goes, where you have to take into account the environment, only realize that the environment can be and might be malleable, and therefore change our lives to become more than we are. Now, the idea that we are going to somehow make things better because we use new terminology is, I think, a misnomer as well. When we speak of the flaws of rhetoric here, what I'm referring to, of course, is the idea of saying, well, you can play a role-playing game, but you need to have certain safety features built in, and you certainly need to take into account the personality and experiences of your players and gauge your story in kind. These phrases are just new terms, but they are not accurate. The idea that the safety of another player is in the way that I perceive my world or the way I express my world is itself a flaw, because they're not actually perceiving of the world that I'm seeing. And as a storyteller, I want to share that out with everyone. And we have to therefore learn to work with a vocabulary across the board that actually reaches out to other players where they are and reaches them where they live. The reality is that the very concept of moving to a world without imagination is itself a calcifying experience. When we fail to think about what might be and only deal with what is, we automatically set boundaries and limitations to our actions and our activities, and therefore express outwardly the limitations that we have, and eventually they become more and more stringent because we aren't wanting to push those boundaries, and therefore we're living within the framework. We're here at the end of the episode, and I'd ask you to perhaps give me some ways that you would find to be able to be imaginative without being creative in the process. How do you imagine a world without seeing at least the limitations or framework itself as possibly sacrificed to that option for creativity? I want to thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin. We're here 2 or 3 days a week. I'm here with NycosRPG. If you want to know more about what we're doing, check out the link down below, and I will see you in the next